I'd like to call our speakers up, and then I'm going to be introducing them to you. Elaine Allensworth is the Lewis Sebring Director of the University of Chicago Consortium on Chicago School Research. And as a member of the steering committee for the consortium, I've had the chance to see Elaine in action for a long time and seen her dedication to careful scholarship, but I've also seen another side of her. And she can get pretty fiery and frankly pissed off sometimes at injustices. And I asked her, where does that come from? And I learned she was a high school teacher. I also learned she was a redhead. So you'll make your own conclusions. But we've invited her to be feisty today and not just tell us the research, but what the research means and how we should all think about it. Dr. Beshon Smith is coming to us from Baltimore City Schools. That's the whole name, Baltimore City Schools. She's got a number of titles there. She's a manager of attendance, right? And like CPS, the names keep changing all over. Titles, you have to figure out what they really mean. But she's got other titles too. Youth advocate, change agent, you'll hear more about that. I read about Baltimore's work online first at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, which is a national campaign, and Baltimore is a pace-setting district. But I knew that we really wanted Beshon to come when I talked to her on the phone, and she said, well, my burning question about all this is why. So we'll hear more about the why. And our final speaker is Colleen Cichetti. All right, I did it. Who is from Lurie Children's Hospital. And I think it's interesting we have a hospital here. This is unusual for us. She's the director of the Community-Linked Mental Health Services Program, which is working on a very deep, deep partnership between CPS and the hospital to bring mental health services to schools. And I first heard Colleen speak at an Illinois Coalition on Childhood Trauma meeting, and I was blown away by the deep work that's happening. And I think you'll be very interested in hearing how that's working with CPS schools in both the welcoming schools and in the schools that were the transformation high schools. Thank you very much. Elaine, take it away.
Thank you, Kim. I'm really happy to be able to talk about using data to drive improvements in student achievement. You know, a lot of times we focus on problems and what needs to change, but if we're really serious about improvement, we need to look at what really worked, what have we had success with, and what lessons can we learn from that. And we have a lot of lessons that we can learn from using early warning indicators in the 9th grade. Graduation rates in Chicago are at their highest point ever, and they're projected to keep going up. This means dramatically better lives for thousands and thousands of kids. So 15 years ago, when I first started looking at issues of dropout in Chicago, it really seemed like an impossible problem to address. Research said that dropout came from an accumulation of myriad factors in kids' lives, from family backgrounds to health to peers to neighborhoods to their entire educational history, all the way from kindergarten through high school. Well, when you think about it that way, it's really an impossible problem to address, right? I mean, if all these things outside of school and before high school are affecting whether or not kids graduate, what are high schools supposed to do? And on top of that, research said, because it's affected by so many things, you can't really predict who's going to drop out. Okay, so what are you going to do? Well, when I talk to people at schools about the problem of dropout, invariably the conversation would go to students returning from incarceration. And then it would go to pregnant and parenting teens. And those are children with very serious issues in terms of getting to graduate, but they represent this much of the dropouts, right? At the time, the district graduation rate was about 53%. That meant the typical average student was at risk of dropping out, not just students with extremely difficult situations, right? But that's where everyone's focus was going. So the first step in addressing a problem is to understand it, understand the scope of the problem, and see if how people are perceiving it lines up with reality. Can't remember who said this, but they say that any system is designed to perfectly produce the outcomes it gets. So that means if you want to change the outcomes, you're going to have to challenge people's perception of the world, right? Of how they see the problem. It also means that you're going to have to get them to change their practices. And they're doing what they're doing because they think it's the best way to do it, right? So that's going to take time. It's going to take time not just to understand the problem, but to allow people time to process it and change the way they're seeing the problem, and then to figure out what they're going to do about it and change the way they're doing things. So 15 years ago, my colleague at the University of Chicago, Melissa Roderick, brought attention to the problem of the 9th grade transition and the incredibly high failure rates from which students never recovered, and found that even students who had been doing fine in 8th grade often struggled with failure in high school. So after that, CCSR, the Consortium on Chicago School Research, had requests from people working with middle graders to let them know how their 8th grade graduates were doing once they get to high school. So, to answer their request, Shazia Miller, a former colleague of mine, developed the on-track indicator. It's just a really simple, basic indicator of whether students are making sufficient progress in their first year of high school. Basically, that they're passing most of their classes. But it turns out that one indicator is extremely predictive of whether or not they eventually graduate. So, we footnoted that relationship in a chapter someplace. And then Arnie Duncan was looking to expand accountability metrics for high school because all of the metrics that were available were things at the end of high school, ACT scores, graduation rates. So he put that metric into the high school accountability system. Well, when he did that, we realized, oh, we need to validate it. And so we started looking into it a little bit more. And when we did that, we found out, oh my God, it was way more predictive than we even realized. It held with the exact same relationship among all subgroups of students at all schools, and it was way more predictive than any other background factor, race, gender, income, or prior test scores. And in fact, once we knew whether or not a student was on track in 9th grade, all that other information didn't really tell us much more about whether or not they would graduate. Because all of those other background factors, they affect graduation by affecting students' performance in their courses. So if I know how a student is doing in their courses, I don't have to know all of those other things. And that's really powerful, because it means that schools don't have to fix crime and pregnancy and all these other things going on in the world. They have to keep their attention on how kids are doing in their classes and keep all those other factors from interfering in their coursework. And that is actually a manageable task. So we have this indicator. We know it's predictive, but it's not actionable, right? It's not very sensitive. It's a very blunt kind of instrument. You can't even find out what your on-track rates are till the end of the year. So the next step was to see if maybe there's other information that's related to on-track that schools could use earlier in the year to identify students who are at risk of being on track. And so that's what we did. And if you look in your packet, we have a couple of charts from a study that showed, you know what? You can look at students' grades, their attendance, their pass rates, and those are at least as predictive as on track, and they're much more sensitive, and they're available way from the beginning of the year. So this is the relationship between four-year graduation rates and 9th grade GPA. Now, this chart was made at a time when graduation rates were 53%. But among students with a B average in 9th grade, they all graduated. These are all low-income students here too, right? But they had a B average. It's not like most of them graduated. They all graduate, right? Meanwhile, students who have failed half their classes, they have a 0.5 GPA, they're not graduating, right? When I used to talk to people about the interventions around graduation and dropout, almost invariably people would say, oh, we have this intervention for kids who are failing half their classes. Of course, that's where you would aim your intervention because these students are obviously at risk of dropout. Okay, so you give them a mentor, give them a tutor. Well, if you have a 6% chance of graduating and I double your chance of graduating, you're still not graduating. So invariably, these modest interventions would be ineffective and people would get frustrated. Meanwhile, there are a lot of students with, say, C-, D+ grade point averages. They seem like they're doing okay, but these are the students that really could go either way, right? Where a modest intervention could have a big effect. Here's another chart that shows four-year graduation rates by 9th grade absences. A lot of times, people think it's the students who are missing lots of school who drop out. And they do drop out, yes. But even missing smaller amounts of school can really eventually lead to dropout. So that a student who misses 1 extra week of class per semester lowers their likelihood of graduating by 25 percentage points. And I'm going to come back to these charts later when I talk about how schools can use this information. Okay, so this is all actionable data. It's all in the realm of what teachers care about anyway. And CPS, the Office of Graduation Pathways, took this information to the next level. And what they did made all the difference in the world. They started putting out early warning indicator reports with real-time data that schools could use in their daily work. And I'm going to talk about that right now. But what I want to say is, this wasn't the reform that was mandated. It was a reform that was encouraged. And it wasn't just because On Track was in the accountability system. If you look at when Arne Duncan put On Track, the 9th grade On Track indicator in the accountability system, you do see a spike up in that year only, right? And then it went back down. I don't know what happened in that year. People started paying attention. Whatever they did, it wasn't sustainable. It went back down to where it had been, in the high 50s, low 60%. But it wasn't until 2009 when schools started getting data reports. And when they started working on those data reports, and the district put in resources, and the Network for College Success, which I'll talk about, also started working with schools around their data, that we see improvements. And we've seen more and more improvements ever since. And it's a reform that I feel like has been very organic. Some principals were really on top of this at first, where they had resources and supports, and they started working on Track. They found success. It spread to other schools. The AP from one school then becomes a principal at another school, and it spread. Our network chiefs helped spread it, and it really was more of a bottom-up kind of reform with support from the top, with support from the district. Okay, so what happened? There are basically 3 general ways that I see schools using the early warning indicator data to drive improvement. The first is by focusing attention on the problems that are most key, right? Keeping conversations focused on the most pressing problems. So like I was saying here, we have a lot of students, they look like they're doing okay. They're not doing okay, they're at high risk. And it also helps keep conversation, when you have data, it can help keep conversations on data and on the real problems rather than finger pointing. So if you have a conference, say, with a parent and a teacher, and student has been absent, it's very tempting to say, you're not doing your job as a parent, or your teachers suck, that's why my child isn't coming. But you don't have to have that kind of conversation. You can say, hey, your child's missed 2 weeks of school so far in this first semester of freshman year. That means their chance of graduating is 41%. If they miss another week, that goes down to 21%. How are we going to keep that from happening, right? Keep the conversations focused on the data. The second way it helps is by identifying the right kids for the right kind of intervention. So I said in 2009, the Department of Graduation Pathways at CPS started putting out these early warning indicator reports with this real-time data. So I was doing a study at this time where I was interviewing 9th graders and their teachers throughout the school year. So it was really interesting to hear how they talked about On Track in these reports. One of the reports that the district put out was the 9th grade watch list. And this was just a list of the students who were at risk of failure in 9th grade that schools got before the start of the 9th grade year so they could reach out in the summer. And I know at one school, for example, they had an on-track coordinator, and she used that time to establish relationships with students before the school year even started, right? So before they were getting in trouble. And during the school year, I'd hear students talk to me and they'd say, oh, I really like so-and-so, Miss So-and-so. She really cares about me. She won't let me miss a single day of school, right? They also put out, and this is what I think is the meat of the system, the freshman success reports, which were these reports that came out in the school year that flagged students whose attendance had dropped or who were getting D's or F's in their classes. And the way they were designed, they had students' grades and attendance in each of their core classes. So you could have 9th grade teams sit down and look at who had been flagged and share information about students. So there might have been a student who was failing in one class but doing fine in another. Well, maybe that one teacher knew how to reach that student, right? Or knew something about that student and could share that information with the other teacher where the student wasn't doing so well. Or a student might have been doing poorly across all their classes, and then teachers could talk about, okay, what are we going to do to support the student so that they're getting coherent messages across all their classes? I know at another school there was an on-track coordinator who would call in conferences for every student who had an F on their midterm grade report, call in a conference with their parent, their teacher, and the student to figure out, why are you failing this class? Why is the student failing this class, and what can we do about it? And I know I was interviewing this one student, and she hated her AVID teacher, really hated her, was always skipping the class, and had been failing it. She said, yeah, but Miss So-and-so, she called in my mom and my teacher. We all sat down, and now both my mom and my teacher are making sure I'm coming every day. So, well, at least now I'm getting a C, right? So, these kinds of reports were really key because they lead to conversations about why performance is low. And then you can figure out a solution to the problem rather than just complaining about it or saying, you need to start doing your work. You need to start coming to class. When you talk with students, you find out that a lot of times they're struggling with really serious problems, and there are reasons they're not coming to class. Like they have a chronically ill parent, or they're feeling threatened by another student at school. A lot of times these problems are solvable, but you're not going to solve them until you find out why they're having that problem. And, and even if it's because they just don't feel like doing the work, once they know that someone's going to be on them every single day and monitoring, that makes them more likely to actually come to class and get their work done. And it's actually really powerful to students because students want their teachers to care about their success as learners. And when adults reach out to find out why they're struggling and help them, they interpret that as care. When adults don't say anything and just give them a failing grade, they interpret that as being unfair. Okay? So these tools gave schools the opportunity to develop systems around supporting students. And then monitoring the data on attendance and grades led to greater personalization, finding out why students were struggling rather than just punishing them for struggling. Okay, that was 2 ways you can use these data. Third way is to look at your patterns to be strategic. Ultimately, you don't want to solve this problem one student at a time. You want to figure out if there are structural issues in your school that are leading to large groups of students underperforming. And that's how you're going to make substantial progress. So here I want to call attention to my colleagues at the University of Chicago, the Network for College Success out of SSA, who work with teams of high schools to really help them analyze their data, figure out what's been successful, what hasn't, who they're actually working with well, who they're not. And one of the key features of their model is bringing teams together from schools to look at each other's data. It's really hard to interpret your own data without context. You may see, oh, my students with high test scores are more likely to be on track than my students with low test scores. That doesn't really tell me anything. But if I see that my students with low test scores are doing worse than the students with the exact same test scores at another school, that tells me I may have something to learn from that other school, right? And so having those conversations can really give you a perspective on what you might think about doing differently, and it gives you a chance to learn from other schools. Okay, so we've had a lot of success with 9th grade. Can we have other success with early warning indicators at earlier grades or with post-secondary outcomes? And I definitely think we can. We have some research coming out pretty soon that looks at middle grade indicators of high school success and high school indicators of post-secondary success. We have some research that just came out looking at how attendance in preschool is related to achievement in the elementary grades. In general, we find that the same middle grade indicators and elementary grade and preschool indicators seem to be the same all the way along, which is grades and attendance, right? It's the same indicators that tell you whether a student is going to fail and whether a student is going to be college ready. And we also found that the exact same middle grade indicators with the exact same thresholds that could identify students at high risk were the same ones that had been found by other researchers who had been looking for indicators of dropout in Philadelphia, right? So, and basically students who are chronically absent in the elementary middle grades are extremely likely to fail when they get to high school. Now this is a chart that shows chronic absenteeism by students' grade level. We've long known that chronic absenteeism is a problem in the high schools. And actually, if I had shown you this chart based on data 5 years ago, high school chronic absenteeism would have looked way worse because it's improved a lot. Still a long way to go, but it's improved a lot. Preschool, we have a lot of students who are chronically absent. But a lot of times we think, okay, in elementary and middle grades, attendance rates are much better. It's not something we have to worry about. But actually, you know, we have over 10% of students in those grades who are chronically absent. And a lot of those students are chronically absent year after year after year. And I can tell you right now, those students are extremely likely to drop out of high school. We know already, early on, that if we don't do anything, we've already set these students up for failure and their teachers up for failure when they get to high school. So I think there's a lot we can do early on. And not just for getting more students to graduate, but also for college readiness. You can't see it from this chart, but there are a lot of students who already in the middle grades are off track for college readiness, meaning they have virtually a 0% chance of succeeding in college. And we can tell that just by looking at their grades and their attendance in the middle grade years. And in the high schools too, we have a lot of students who are losing, who come into high school with strong grades, strong test scores, strong attendance. They get to high school, suddenly they have C averages, and they're no longer likely to succeed in college. So we could think about using early warning indicators not just to prevent failure and dropout, but also to make sure students are reaching their potential and achieving college readiness. So just to finish off, I just want to say, as Linda said, people are swimming in data that is not useful for informing change. For data to be useful, it has to focus attention on those factors that matter most for later outcomes. Researchers like to make things complicated, bring in all the factors that could potentially matter for an outcome, and practitioners like to do this too. How many meetings have you been in when people bring up everything, including the kitchen sink? Oh, we need to think about this and that and that and that. Well, when you do that, it becomes too difficult to work on the problem. Systems that are too complicated or that contain elements that aren't strongly related to the outcomes we ultimately care about or are redundant, they're not useful, and it can lead to wasted effort and frustration. We also have to remember that data should be easy to use and integrated into people's regular work. The 9th grade early warning indicators worked, I'm going to go to this one, because schools developed systems for using the data to support students and staff so that they could do their jobs more effectively. The reports came automatically. People didn't have to find someone to go and bring the report, get the report. They were just there, right? They were simple, they were organized in a way that made sense for people's work, and they were timely. And the third thing we have to remember is that people need time to collaborate around data to develop and evaluate strategies. You can't just hand somebody data and expect them to figure out what it means and what they're going to do about it. Data is a great tool for focusing conversation on what's really happening with students and in schools, but it's not the data itself that makes the change. It's the conversations and the actions around that data that matter. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that very informative presentation, Colleen. I learned a lot about the work that's being done in Chicago from your presentation, and there was one thing in particular that I think really spoke to some of the things that I would like to share this morning. I am Dr. Beshon Smith, and I'm here on behalf of Baltimore City Public Schools. I manage the Office of Attendance and Truancy, and my work is really around grounding the issue of attendance and poverty and social trauma and connecting it to student academic acceleration and achievement. And you said that we need to challenge perspectives in order to change practices. And I think that Baltimore City Public School System is in a season of that. We pride ourselves with being a data-driven district. We have the capacity to identify data as large as the geographical community of our prevalent chronic absent students. We're able to narrow it down by bus route. We have partnerships with Johns Hopkins University and the University of Baltimore that have allowed us to even look at the classrooms that the children are coming from who suffer from the worst attendance problems. But one of the things I think we have been falling short on as a district is what to do with that data. And so we have embarked on this year of why. And so we know what's going on. We know that last year we had over 19,000 students that missed about a month of school. That's almost a quarter of our population. And so the question becomes why? Because we can't really implement effective strategy without being able to go deeper than the quantitative discernment that we have these young people that are not coming to school, what's going on in our communities. And so from the data, we push forward a year. This entire school year has really been about framing the issue of attendance, not as an isolated incident, but as the result of some bigger issues, right? Because attendance in and of itself doesn't really tell us anything, right? Because it's homelessness plus illness equals absence. If you combat the homelessness, if you took care of the illness, there's an assumption that the young person would be able to come to school. It's a jailed parent plus a love-struck teenager equals absence. You help the young person manage their emotions, and you figure out a way to connect the parent to the child even while they're in prison, and you can assume that you can minimize the absences. And so as a result of asking the question why and really challenging the perspectives, there are three things that have really come out of our work this year. There are three focus areas that I want to share with you. The first thing has been a district-wide ownership of attendance, right? Understanding that attendance is the foundation of all the things that we're doing as a system. So we can have rigorous instruction, and we can have quality teacher recruitment, and we can have really good curriculum, but if the young people aren't coming into the building, then none of that is relevant. And so one of the first things we did this year was to have a district-wide ownership of attendance. And so now attendance is everybody's issue. When I came on board, I was the Office of Attendance and Truancy, and so it belonged to me. But one of the things that I was able to show them that is that the transportation department in headquarters impacts attendance and how responsive they are to requests for transportation. The special education department impacts attendance and how responsive they are to necessary IEP meetings. Suspension services hugely affects attendance and what the code of conduct and how you respond to disciplinary issues. The chief academic officer, the CEO, all owns the issue of attendance. And so one of the things that has really, really shifted in the last 6 months is the mandate around we as a community own attendance. And so our chief executive officer has mandated from principals, from executive directors, from every director of every department that they meet with me every quarter to talk about attendance. She mandates that during the executive directors who are the direct supervisors of the principals, we are divided into networks. And so there's a cluster of schools in a particular network, and there's an executive director that supervises all the principals in that school. When they have their quarterly check-ins with the superintendent of Baltimore City Public Schools, they have to have their attendance plan as part of their quarterly check-ins, which means every 4 months, I get a scurry of emails and requests to meet, and I'm really able to talk about the data and to talk about the strategies that we can use to support the data because everyone owns it. And so a district-wide ownership of attendance has made the world of a difference in how we position ourselves and even how we talk about attendance. The second thing has been partnerships. You know, we're dealing, especially when we're dealing with urban communities, we are dealing with the whole child, right? And so you can't talk history and expect an A in mathematics when kids are hungry. You can't ask a young person to focus on their social studies project when their mom is being beat all night. And so the reality is that unless we are able to really look at the whole child, then we'll just be tackling issues incrementally, and it'll never address all that the young person is carrying because they need to be able to focus on school, but you can't do that if life is in a havoc. And so we know that as a school building with the limited resources, we weren't able to do that. And community partners have been so critical to even our ability to ask the question why, right? And so we have an amazing partnership with Johns Hopkins and the University of Baltimore, and they provide the data. They did a really great research project on our early learning grades and really talked about what the issues specifically in Baltimore City are as it relates to pre-K and early learning. And now we are actually preparing and seeking funding for them to do the same thing on a high school level. We have the Baltimore Student Attendance Collaborative, and there's an information sheet about them in your packet, which represents at least 50 organizations that are already in 106 of our schools. We have 196 schools, and we come together every single month. I partnered with the director of that collaborative, and we are setting the agenda together. And she's asking me, what do the schools need? Can we bring principals to the collaborative? Can we hear from the schools, right? And so the shift in that was, in the previous 3 to 5 years, the organizations was coming and they were saying, this is what we do. We make bracelets. Well, now, if we've decided that it's going to be a necklace that's going to make a difference, making the bracelet is not necessarily what my school needs. And so what we've been able to shift is that as a community organization, there's a legitimate collaboration on the needs of the school. And so partners are making phone calls in the evening. Partners are doing home visits when kids don't show up. Partners are helping kids with their homework that aren't there just for tutoring. They're establishing relationships with our students and with our families that's really helping them to mitigate the other circumstances in their lives. And the mayor has been extremely, extremely critical as well. She has assisted us with resources. She hosts attendance competition every quarter. Twice a year, she does elementary in the fall, and she does middle school and high school in the spring. and it encourages the schools to come together as a community, and encourages parents. She invites parents and principals to City Hall, and we have attendance roundtables. And so partnerships has really been critical, because as a school system, we just really can't do it ourselves. And the last thing, which was really the pleasant surprise for me, has been the need to build the capacities of our schools, right? And so I'm a sociologist by training, I'm a youth advocate by passion, and I came into the district with some assumptions about what adults understand about young people, or the realities of what race, class, and gender presents on a daily basis. But that wasn't necessarily a common or universal understanding within the schools. And so the third thing that the data has really helped us to understand we need to do is to build the capacity of the schools to support families, right? And so the first initiative that we implemented in our office was called ACT, A-C-T, and it stands for Attendance Can Be Taught. And it exceeds the fact that parents need to learn about attendance, but as school officials, as administrators, we all need to learn about attendance. And so ACT involves professional development for teachers, professional development for attendance monitors and principals. We spent this entire year just having a discourse that challenges the existing perspective around attendance, which is, for the most part, kids don't come to school because either their parents are lazy and don't care, or teenagers aren't coming to school because they don't realize how important it is. Well, we've done a lot of focus groups and have found both of those to be truly myths, that there are other issues in a young person's or an adult's life that keeps them from prioritizing school. And so we've committed as a district to figuring out what that why is. And so I think that the data is huge, and so as part of that capacity development thing, we are requiring that every school has an identified attendance team. In some schools, that team is 9 people. In some schools, that team is 2 people. But nonetheless, the fact that there is a structured, predictable, purposeful, scheduled meeting that simply looks at data every 2 weeks on students, and in order to get to the issue of why, because we already know there's no dispute that they're not coming, but there's a lot of assumptions around why. And so I'm really excited about this forum, because I think that as a community, a school community, we owe it to our young people to figure this out, because like you said, Colleen, the issue of disproportionate minority confinement, a teenage pregnancy, and all of that stuff will always be here, unfortunately. And so our question is, okay, so what else do we do about it? The conversations that we've been having, the work that we have continued to do, has not necessarily worked, because our graduation rates in urban communities continues to be disappointing, and our children are suffering from it. And so I think that as a school community, we need to have more of these conversations, we need to have more ownership of it, and we need to be able to step out of ourselves and question our dominant thoughts around attendance and why students aren't coming to school. Thank you.
So my name's Colleen Cichetti, and as Kim mentioned, I have a different perspective, but it's one that resonates with everything that you've heard so far, which is really exciting. I think the really interesting thing as I thought about coming and speaking to an audience of educators, which is what I actually spend most of my time doing, but more folks that are on the ground level, is that when I really think about a public health approach, which is really what I'm here to talk about, in many, many ways, school is the ultimate public health model. From the beginning of time, schools have always said, what do we give every kid? How do we meet the needs of all the kids? And what do we add on when kids need more? What's interesting is that mental health hasn't always been part of that. And so many of the key things that I heard today really reflect that. Because mental health and kids' social emotional issues and what's going on in our communities and neighborhoods is, in fact, the why. And what we need to do is exactly what Elaine said, which is we need to figure out, for those kids that are off track, for those kids that we see academics are not progressing in the ways that we want, we need to figure out what the right intervention is for that student to get them on track. And what we see is that in many of our schools, that is really the challenge, as well as our community. So this slide is just up here to show you that we believe that in this country, we are having a failure in providing mental health services to students. We believe that on average, about 20% of kids who need some kind of mental health support are getting that support, and that's across the entire socioeconomic spectrum. So think about the schools and communities that are struggling the most, and we know those kids are simply not getting mental health services. They are not coming to places like Children's, and they're not even coming to places like the Community Mental Health Center that's down the street. We are not meeting their needs. So it's really important that we start thinking about why this is so critical. From a mental health perspective, what that means is that we are only reaching kids at the highest end. We have lots of stigma, lots of barriers, lots of people saying that school is one place that I need to be successful, but mental health, that's not for me. And there's signs, you see us doing these public awareness things, mental health for everyone. Well, guess what? That's not gonna change until folks start to see that the interventions that we have as mental health professionals are actually benefiting students. So we have got to find those kids. My colleagues will say to me, why do you spend all your time driving all around Chicago? You could sit in your office and see kids. I could sit in my office and see maybe 30 kids, but by going out and talking to the community partners and the school personnel who are working and living in these communities with kids all day long and changing their practice, I have the potential to impact 500,000 kids, and that is critical to me. So when we talk about from a mental health perspective, we believe that getting our interventions to work in schools and using a skill-based approach that fits in with the model of teaching kids what they need to do to be successful so they can be those kids that are meeting those freshman 9th grade on-track ratings, and then ultimately, from your perspective, you don't want to just graduate kids. You want kids who are going to be successful in life and in college. And we know that the academic side is one very important part of that, but we have to think about the social emotional side as well. So the good news is, always good to hear some good news about our state, because often we're the laughing stock of many things, but Illinois is actually ahead of the game on this funny thing called social emotional learning. About 2003, the governor actually asked for a task force to look at the state of mental health delivery in the state of Illinois, and it was atrocious. Not surprising. So we were even lower than that 20% rate. And so what came out of that was the Illinois Children's Mental Health Act, which was a mandate to go out and figure out what do we need to do to be getting more kids services. And as part of that, the really innovative thing was, what are school districts gonna do? School districts were told they have to implement plans to get kids these skills, and they have to have those ready to go so that we can put those out there. And what grew out of that are two really important things here in Chicago. One was that there was state standards for social emotional learning. The state of Illinois was the very first state in the union to do that. Fortunately, we have some really great advocates from Castle and other people here in Chicago that are getting the rest of the country to think about that, but we actually adopted it before anybody else, which is kind of cool. And Chicago Public Schools in 2004 said, okay, we got to do this, and they put in these laws. And they said, here's the social emotional policy, and then we're going to start doing that. That was 10 years ago. So we've had 10 years saying that we need to do this. The problem is, with a lot of things in our state, good ideas are unfunded, nobody holds anybody accountable for them, and they're out there on the books. And until people like our colleagues started saying, well, these skills are actually going to be the critical skills to help meet the metrics that you care about, it was sort of out there in a different plane. Because mental health people, I can tell you I need to help these students, but I have to come talk your language. I need to talk about how my strategies are going to help your kids be successful in the things that you are being evaluated on. So if I am going to pull a student from reading to give them a mental health intervention for 10 weeks, you better believe it that I better have some data that tells you that that's going to help your kids' grades in the long run. Because as long as I just say I'm doing it because it's warm and fuzzy and I believe in kids feeling good about themselves, that shouldn't be something that you want in your buildings. And so a lot of the conversation that you mentioned earlier around community partners and holding people accountable and saying, who's in my building and what are we giving them is really critical. So when we think about children's mental health. It's hard to see these, I apologize. But basically what we know is there's a lot more people out there trying to help than people realize. I spend a lot of my time telling folks there's a lot going on in these buildings. We call some of our buildings Christmas tree schools, because every single person in the community wants to help, and some of our principals don't know what to do except for let them come in. And so there's all kinds of people tripping over each other trying to help certain schools, and then there's the school down the street that has nothing. But what I've come to see is that until we integrate it and have some process where we know what's in the building, we know where we're allocating the resources to the students who need them, we're not helping students. We might have a kid who's got 3 different people involved in his life and other kids who get nothing. So what we really want to do is to think about how do we integrate that? How do we coordinate that? And there's different ways to do that. Some of you have probably seen the RTI triangle, currently now being called the multi-tiered systems of support triangle, and it's known as the PBIS triangle, whatever you want to call it. But in any case, the thing here is if you look on that left side, the academic side, you all have been doing that for a long time on the academic side. We give all kids good instruction, we make sure that people are teaching what they need to be teaching, and when kids don't learn it, we elevate that, we pull kids out in small groups, we reteach them, and then the kids who really need the most get some small group support. That piece of the model, CPS jumped right in and put in place. The other side, the behavioral side, we've been trying to get in place for 10 years. Before Arnie Duncan left, Brian Samuels was driving this work. And we were trying to say, how do we align all this behavioral stuff that wasn't in the law? Because people were already recognizing that if we don't do the same thing on that side, we're not going to make the same progress. So my work and the work with what's now called the Office of Social Emotional Learning has been, how do we integrate those two things, get those two systems to talk? How do we apply the same rigorous data and standards and structures to the behavioral side that's being done on the academic side? And how do we have conversations so that we are doing what she mentioned earlier, Dr. Smith, around what is it that's impacting this kid's inability to be successful and stay on track as a freshman? And can we get those services to them? Can we get them to them in 3rd grade? Can we prevent these things? So this is what we're trying to put in place, and I can tell you doing this is not that easy. This is a very complicated slide, but what this tells you is all of the things that are going on in CPS schools right now from a multi-tiered perspective, all are evidence-based, have coaches and people invested in figuring out how do we get all kids the skills that they need in terms of their social and emotional skills, how do we teach adults to manage classrooms with effective strategies so that they're spending more time teaching and less time managing behavior. We also have a new initiative that's going on in several of our schools to bring in trauma and the trauma lens and say, how do we understand how this is impacting our students so that everyone in the building understands that when someone's not in school, you gotta ask why. You don't just go to, he doesn't care, he's not involved, blame the parents, blame whomever. You say, this kid's not coming to school for a reason, and it's my job as the teacher and the principal and the social worker and the dean to figure out what are we gonna do to get them there and to get them to be ready to learn. Because if they're not ready to learn, then they can't function. So the work that I do is mostly around using data to help people track across those 3 tiers. Many people are helping on the universal level. My work as a clinician has been really to drive the work on the secondary level, or that tier 2 intervention. So we have been in the practice for the last 8 years. We've trained over 1,000 CPS social workers, psychologists, and counselors to deliver interventions that have an evidence base. That we can say at the end of the day, if you do this with fidelity, which we're gonna track, and we're gonna provide you support, we believe that this kid will benefit in a 10, 15-week curriculum. We know that we're taking the right kids and giving them those interventions, and we believe that if we train folks to use specific data to select the right kid for the right intervention, that we are going to be able to measure success. Right now, we've trained, like I said, over 1,000 clinical people in CPS. We've also trained over 300 community partners. And they all do this. This is complicated. You don't have to read any of it. But the key is people are thinking about this. It's not random. It's not, okay, you have this great mentoring group. Go sit in the lunchroom and recruit kids. Because guess what? If I'm being evaluated and my funding's coming on whether or not my mentoring program works, I'm not picking the kids that you want in my mentoring program. I'm picking whoever shows up and who I think I'm going to show success, because that's how I'm going to get more grant dollars and be successful. So we have to think about teachers identifying what kids are struggling, and then a team of people thinking about what does that kid need to make progress. And what are we going to start with? How are we going to evaluate if it works? And how are we going to come back at the end and move it forward? And if we do that, we're going to be able to have success. So, you know, I don't have a lot of time, but I'd be happy to answer questions later. But I think the really key thing here is that we do know what needs to be done. We have put in place for 10 years structures and strategies. But I can tell you that moving from knowing what to do and doing it is really hard. You all know that. Change doesn't come easy. People have mentioned that. We've got to figure out how to move that forward. So we have, at this point, while we might have 85% of the mental health professionals in the building trained to do this, most of them, their jobs, the amount of time they can spend providing for gen ed kids, not special ed kids, is about 3 hours a week. The rest of their time is spent treating those kids who are already off track or are really at the highest top of that pyramid. So what we need to do is think about how do we create innovative practices? How do we change the roles of our community partners so that when they come, they're doing what you want them to do, and they're doing it with fidelity? How do we change the community partner training? How do we train the teachers as well as the administrators to identify those kids? And then how do we create job descriptions and allocate our resources to meet the needs of the kids that are there? The last thing I want to say is we also need to integrate our data systems. Right now I have lovely data on all of the interventions and whether they work, but only in the few schools that have a lot of resources, like the transformation schools, are we able to look at my data and the data of the school grades and metrics, attendance, behavior, and grades. So we need to create better systems, and they're working on that now. The final thing I'd recommend is that we need to be much more instructive about the kinds of research that's going on in our buildings. We have an IRB that wants to get people in evaluating innovative practice, but oftentimes they're not talking with the folks that are actually promoting these interventions in the first place. How do we bring them together so that as a district you can say, well, we really have a trouble with dating violence. How do we evaluate dating violence programs? How do we bring that together and connect your needs with the resources of our community partners and academic partners who really want to help the kids in the city? So those are some things that I'd recommend, but I think the really good news is the infrastructure is there. There is a strike while the iron's hot kind of thing, and I believe that public health and education are really coming together, and there's some really exciting opportunities for us to help the students of Chicago.
We'll start with a hot question. It sounds like the solution regarding staying on track is relationships, yet we devote increasing resources to testing and the use of tests to inform decisions about things like teacher performance that they're never been intended to assess. Why don't we focus on numbers regarding funding, class size, and so on? This is more of a statement than a question, but it's an issue that's, I think, on everybody's minds. Yeah. Would someone like to respond to that?
Yeah, I could respond. Yeah, tests are important because you want to know what skills students have, and it can give you valuable information. But it's interesting, in order to get test scores up, a focus on testing isn't actually maybe the best way to do that. What actually seems to be most effective is getting kids more strongly engaged in their coursework. So showing up, turning in their work, paying attention, and you only get that by finding out why they're not showing up, getting their work done, paying attention, and reaching out. So the key to raising test scores is actually, figuring out how you get kids more engaged.
Beshon?
I definitely agree with the statement. I think that that's exactly where we are as a district. Our interim CEO, because as you know, we just identified a new CEO, but our interim CEO, Tisha Edwards, is a social worker by training. And so one of the things that she's been working with us on as a district is creating a cycle of student engagement that is similar to the cycle of learning. One of the things that she's really been able to push is the notion that we have frameworks for testing and for teaching and for learning, but the student engagement piece that's at the foundation of teaching and learning is absent. And so as a district, I think obviously it's been slow to come, but we're making steps towards that.
Okay.
Here.
For Elaine, is there evidence that CPS teachers are passing marginal students to keep on-track rate up?
Yeah, you know, I hear that every now and then, and you know, maybe some are doing that. But if they were actually doing that and just, you know, passing students so their 9th grade on-track rates would look good, well, you would think then that students would be failing in 10th grade, right? Because that's not part of the accountability system. But they're not. Actually, as 9th grade on-track rates have gone up, the subsequent year, 10th grade on-track rates are going up. 11th grade on-track rates are going up. We have more students getting to the end of the junior year to take the ACT than ever before. Graduation rates are at their highest rate ever. And you'd also think, well, if you're just keeping all these weak students in and just passing them, then your attendance and your test scores would go down, right? Because these are the weakest kids that you're not doing anything with except passing them through. But attendance and test scores have not gone down. They've actually gone up, right? So we're keeping more kids, and they're actually doing better in school. So maybe getting kids working harder is actually a good strategy for improving achievement as well as graduation rates.
Okay. This is Elaine questions. Here's another one. Why has the on-track indicator worked, but standardized test scores have been less successful in raising achievement levels? It's a variation.
Yeah, so is that, I'm sorry, does that mean that test scores have not improved?
I think this means test scores not an indicator, a good indicator.
Oh, yeah. You know, test scores, they give you some information. They tell you what skills students have in the tested subjects and whether they're able to, you know, respond to questions on a particular kind of format. So, you know, it gives you a basic indication of things like reading skills, math skills, analytic skills. But grades tell you a lot more than that. So grades are based not just on do students perform well in a test, but do they get all their assignments in? Are they completing them at a high level? Can they write good papers? Is their work neat and organized? Is it clear? Does it show that they've really been, you know, putting in a lot of effort? Have they been coming every day? Can they sustain effort over a long period of time over the course of the year? And you also have grades representing not the same thing every time, but you have teachers that are teaching different things, different subjects in different ways, and students have to adjust to those challenges. So they provide a lot more information about whether students are developing a broad range of skills and are able to, you know, to handle different challenges. And that's why I think grades are so much more predictive of how kids are going to do in later years and in the workplace, actually. And it's also highly predictive of whether they're going to be successful as adults.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, schools do not work in isolation. Organizations like Youth Guidance and SGA provide a variety of critical services to students, yet it's extremely difficult to get student-level data with consent on a timely basis. Are there potential solutions to help agencies access data so we can better target our interventions?
That's definitely been a sticky topic in Baltimore City. So the Baltimore Student Attendance Collaborative is a consortium of about 50 organizations, and they are under the Family League and the Open Society Institute. And so the Open Society Institute and the Family League has data agreements with the school system, and so some of those problems have been mitigated through that. But one of the most interesting conversations we had, our superintendent met with the consortium in December. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was the fact that while data is important in terms of outcomes, it shouldn't hinder our ability or the organization's ability to partner with the school to get the work done. And the question that everyone, all of the community organizations were asked to leave with and really think about was, how much data do you really need to do your job, right? So one of the issues was they were only getting attendance data, but they weren't getting addresses, so they didn't know the community that the student was coming from, and they didn't know if the kid had any health issues. And so there was some pushback on the district's part that said, why do you think you need all of that if you're partnering with the school and they have all that, and you're communicating with teachers, and they have a framework for who Beshon is? Why isn't it enough for you to partner with the school and identify where your role is? And so in some instances, it remains a sore, but we've been able to get past it, get around it by focusing on what can be done with the information that you have. And then there are some organizations that are in their second year of application for data from the district.
And I think it's fair to say Chicago has gone at it a slightly different way. One of the things that they've done is created a process. So if you are a provider of mental health services, for example, like Youth Guidance, SGA, we consider those sort of our Uber agencies, and then others, there's a process to become a provider in the buildings. And once you're in that building, you're providing consultation to teachers around the right interventions for the kids. That relationship is under a slightly different rubric than other things. So we are able to provide a lot of consultation at the student level, and in the schools where we brought these care teams or behavioral health support teams together, where we're having those conversations, where teachers make referrals, and then we have conversations about what's the right service for that student, we can bring community partners into those discussions around how to meet kids' needs. So at the student level, I think we are making a lot of progress. At the Uber level, or the policy and research level, I think, again, we have a lot of data that's been collected. Every single kid who's gotten one of these curriculum interventions, we have pre and post data on. We have data that we could look at. But to be honest, it's been a resource issue. Oftentimes, the community partners come in under a grant. At the end of that grant, those folks are gone, and then we get a new grant. Now you hire me to train another huge group of people to come in and do these same interventions, and the messages are lost. And the other issue is that the folks that are doing this work in the Office of Social Emotional Learning, their data system isn't getting the same level of attention as the system that's over there getting some of the other academics. They've worked really hard, and we have so much in there, and I can tell you all of our national partners say, you've done more of this group than anyone in the country. We want some data. So I do think people are correct that we need to look at that, and that's where I think some sort of collaborative with academics and community partners and the district to really say, how do we use that data to make decisions around where, not just where to go and is it effective on a student level, but where to go next.
Related question for Beshon about partner agencies. This person points out that funding for that work is declining as the need is increasing. I'm curious how Baltimore is funding its full-service community schools.
We have been really blessed. The issue of attendance has been huge, and I don't know if Chicago Public Schools have connected with Attendance Works at all, and Hetty Chang, who's like the Obama of attendance, and she came to visit city schools, and she did a presentation to administrators in January. But we, again, Family League, the Open Society Institute, and even the mayor have been really instrumental with connecting us with partnerships and resources. We recently got a grant from the mayor to do an exploratory visit for the City Year program, which would put a couple of hundred graduate and undergraduate students in our schools to provide some family-centered, strength-based support. And the mayor raised the money to have 20 members of the district visit the headquarters in Washington, D.C. We participated in a presentation, and we visited, they chartered a bus, and we spent the whole day at one of the schools that have a city year partnership. And so we've just been really blessed. I think that this is just, it's just an eye-opening season for Baltimore City in general, and everything else that has been tried has been met with a limited amount of success. And whenever we go deeper, attendance and student engagement lies at the bottom of every single issue. And so the resources are there right now, to some extent.
I think also for the state of Illinois, when there are services when there's dollars, they come to CPS. There's no doubt that grants and initiatives, we have City Year, we have a lot of things. But the issue of sustaining that from year to year is definitely a really big challenge. And I think listening to her today, one of the things I'm struck by is that the difference between a deficit model and a resilience model. And I think maybe what we could do is to really think about that, because in our state right now, there's so many holes in our budgets. So we're putting money towards violence prevention. We're putting money towards suspension reduction. We're putting money to stopping holes. But if we could maybe go back to the mayor and say, we want you to go raise that same amount of money, not just for our high-risk students, but also for attendance across the board. Because I believe there would be lots of people out on the streets marching kids and walking them to school if we said attendance was the most important thing to get kids to graduate. And I think that there's a lot of folks that want to help, and so maybe we need to use that resilience positive to get the folks in the room that are money people and to get the businesses and other folks involved and try, but it's so hard because those news-getting violence and the impact of that is really out there, but I think that we could maybe switch that up and follow Baltimore in that way. It might be helpful.
We got into the Q&A a little bit late, so we'll run a little bit past 9:30. If you have to leave 9:30, go ahead. Otherwise, please stay. A question for Colleen. What are some of the best indicators of social and emotional development and mental health? What tools are being used locally that partners can use to monitor need and impact?
Actually, you should probably answer that.
I think she said Colleen.
Oh,
okay.
Whomever.
It's been confusing which one of us is which. All right, so I think that right now what we're focusing on is a lot of, again, the matching kids from a deficit model, to be honest, and that I'll take responsibility for. We're screening kids to match them to right interventions, and we have tools for that. There's an intervention that, or an assessment tool that's now district-wide. Again, though, I show up at trainings, I was at one yesterday, and some of the folks in the room had never seen it before. So we gotta get better at that, but the Strength and Difficulties questionnaire is a really good basic screener for moving kids from Tier 1 to Tier 2. I think some of the interesting work that's been done around grit and what are the social emotional resiliencies could be useful, as well as certainly within the Tier 1 interventions, the second step in the path, some of those really core. I think our learning standards are good. So if we're tracking kids and including that in their elementary grades, like some of the folks have done in other school districts, where we're really giving parents feedback on how your kids are doing in mastering those things that are going to be those resilience skills, that would be fantastic. And we could certainly move towards that. But I think right now we're using data mostly around identifying kids for the upper tiers, but I think it'd be really exciting to bring in some tools for measuring and evaluating earlier.
Okay. Elaine, to what do you ascribe the high jump in absenteeism between 8th and 9th grade?
So this actually I studied, so I could talk on and on about it, but I'll try not to.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I mentioned that we did the study. We actually started the study when students were in 8th grade. We interviewed them several times in their 8th grade year and interviewed their teachers, observed their classes, and then we followed them into 9th grade, interviewed them 4 times throughout their 9th grade year, interviewed their teachers, observed their classes, and then into the 10th grade year. And so we could see the same students going into a different context, from 8th grade to 9th grade. In 8th grade, you kind of have to opt out of doing your work and not going to class. Students, they go from class to class as a group, or a lot of times they're in self-contained classrooms, so it's really hard to skip. And your teachers tend to know you really well, because a lot of times you have, a primary classroom teacher. Even if you're in a school where you move around, a lot of times you have the same teacher for several classes, so they really get to know you. They know if you're not there, and they also don't let you get away with not doing the work because they know you. The relationships are a lot stronger in the middle grades. Then when you get to high school, suddenly you see each teacher for maybe 40 minutes a day. They don't know you well. They have over 100 other students. They have no idea where you are the rest of the day. And suddenly, it's on you. You have to now opt in, right? In elementary, middle school, you have to decide not to go, right? And a lot of times, your elementary teachers will make you get your work done if it's not done. In high school, you have to decide to go to class, to get your work done. People aren't going to say, go find you in the middle of the day and say, hey, you never turned in that assignment, or hey, you didn't come to class. It just becomes a lot easier to stop doing the work. And you don't have those strong relationships. Teacher-student relationships just plummet when kids move from high school, and it's because of the structure of high schools. What we see is those teachers who are more, there's a huge difference among teachers in the same school in terms of whether their kids show up to classes. And the teachers that get their kids showing up are the ones that are really paying attention to how their kids are doing. They're really monitoring them. They're reaching out right away as soon as a student is absent, finding out why, making sure they don't fall behind, letting them know that they need to come every day and they're going to be watching, finding out when they're having trouble. Is it because they don't understand? Is there something going on? They can't get their work done, so that the student feels like they can be successful. What happens a lot of times is students stop doing work for whatever reason. Maybe they're confused, or maybe they're skipping because their friends are skipping, whatever. They start to fall behind. No one says anything. And so they start doing it more and more. And the more you fall behind, the less you want to keep coming because you're behind and now you're frustrated and you're embarrassed. And if no one stops that cycle, you're just going to keep falling further and further behind.
Okay. A couple of the questioners have noted that we're losing resources, that you're advocating for the schools because of budget cuts. What do you do about that?
So that's one of the biggest realities of my work. I'm in the district office, and my primary audience is the principals, the administrators in the school, and that's always one of the primary concerns. Even when we talk about home visits, the complaint is, I don't have anyone to do home visits. There are teacher unions that cut off the expectation around teacher work hours and things of that nature. And I don't have a glamorous answer to that. What I tell principals is that if you only have $5, you're blessed with the luxury of deciding how you allocate your $5. I understand that if you only have this amount of personnel, then you prioritize and you decide where you put your resources. But even in a deficit, there's still decision-making, and there's still the ability to prioritize, and so what's important gets addressed, and so that's the only answer I have to that, because I think that's a realistic challenge for everybody.
And I would say as well, one of the things that often happens is each new initiative, and with some of the change in leadership, each new initiative, we get a new team. So right now, we're hearing that there's a big focus on suspension reduction, and I'm finding myself saying to schools, don't go create a suspension reduction team. You have already multiple teams in your building that are meeting on a regular basis. So how do we address that particular concern, or how do we align the resources that we already have to address this metric, which is very important? And I'm fully in support of saying we need to decrease suspensions, but we don't need a new team of people in order to do that. And that tends to happen. We start pulling people in, and then they kind of glaze their eyes like, you want me to meet with you for what? How many more hours of meetings? So we need to align the processes and structures and resources that we have. One of the places that I've struggled sometimes is I go in and there's all these teams meeting about social emotional learning, or the team that's meeting on the attendance, and the team that's meeting on whatever the issue is. But yet, when I ask them, where do you have student-level discussions? Where do teachers come and say, I don't know what to do with Johnny? He's in my class, and I'm struggling, and I don't know what to do. And then I can hear from other teachers about either what's working with them, or as a group, they can say, this is a kid who's not responding. We've tried everything, and now we need to look at that behavioral health support team. And there's a lot of folks talking about what we need to do with kids, and we haven't always integrated the conversations about those particular kids. And we need to create safe environments. Educators need to be told it's okay to say I'm struggling with a student. It's okay to say I'm really happy when he doesn't come to my class, because frankly he disrupts my history lesson every day. And you need to be able to say that not so that you can kick him out of your class, but so you can learn what other folks are doing and how they've engaged that student and how they have a relationship, or who has that relationship to get that kid to be successful. Because if you do that and everyone's honest and open about how hard it is, will decrease our teacher reduction. About 50% of new teachers are dropping out. And they're not dropping out because they really do want to be bankers. They're dropping out because they come to school every day thinking they're going to do their best job and they feel helpless. And we are really needing to look at how do we align the time that they have for PD, the kinds of conversations they're engaged in, and their work not being so isolated so they can problem solve and be successful, and kids then ultimately will benefit and be successful as well.
A few more for Elaine. Which schools have on-track coordinators? How are they selected and organized? Who are the coordinators? Are they school staff, counselors, volunteers? Talk a little bit about that model.
Yeah, so I don't know which of all the schools have on-track coordinators right now. You know, in the very first year that the district started implementing the early warning indicator, or giving out the early warning indicator reports, they actually had funding for 6, I think, high schools to get 2 on-track coordinators. And so they funded on-track coordinators for the first couple years. Other schools did not have them. I think as people saw the success of on-track indicators, more and more schools figured out how to use funding that they have for on-track coordinators. But, you know, it's just a matter of where the school wants to put its resources.
I think those schools that got it were schools that tended to be the most challenged schools. A lot of the resources go into the most challenged schools, so we've developed models in those and brought in extra resources, and now the challenge is how do we embed those models in people's job descriptions so they can do that work and we can develop it out to the rest of the district. Because the models we developed, even in those turnaround schools, they were great. They had at least 5 counselors. They had all kinds of folks working with these kids and following them for the whole time they went through, and they could do a lot of that monitoring. But as those dollars have gone away, we see that those resources go away. So until we build it into sustainable job descriptions, it's going to be really hard to bring it to the rest of the district. But I think the good news is the data that's out there on the fact that these things work is there, and certainly a counselor who could be the freshman on track or a paraprofessional, or bringing in those community partners, if we can sustain and maybe look at some Medicaid reform and get people to be paid to be in the buildings to do that work, those are all ways that we could maybe add to the work, because grants in education shouldn't be paying for the mental health resources either. So if we could redirect those resources, that might help as well.
Okay. I think you answered this, Elaine, but we'll double check. Have there been unintended consequences of the focus on attendance? For example, are schools pushing out low attending students?
Oh, no, I would say the opposite. I mean, if you look at the change in attendance in high schools, we see, you know, dramatic improvements in attendance. I know that, and you know, we do not see that students are being pushed out. In fact, if anything, we're keeping more of the students that were coming in that were low achieving. You know, at the same time that there's been a huge rise in 9th grade on track and 9th grade attendance, the entering achievement of kids in high schools has been pretty flat. I mean, it's not like they're getting higher achieving kids coming into the high schools. They're getting the same kids. They're just keeping them more and keeping them in school more. And, you know, I know there's always a concern if you keep in more of your low achieving kids, you're going to drive down your test scores, you're going to drive down achievement in the school. But the interesting thing about the way this has happened is they're actually getting kids more engaged and working harder, and that's actually driving up achievement in the school rather than driving it down.
Does it make any difference whether absences are excused or not in terms of using them as a predictor?
Okay, from my perspective, no. If they're not in school, they're not learning. Right? And whether a student gets counted as an excused or unexcused, a lot of times it's really fuzzy. You know, did the parent write a note or not? You know, what does the parent think is an excuse? You know, there's, you know, it's a fuzzy line. And if you start paying just attention to unexcused absences, you really miss a big piece of the picture.
The last question, I don't fully understand it, but you may, so I'll ask it. How can citywide and school-wide business intelligence tools help with daily attendance and learning support? How can smart learning and health cards help? Does that question resonate with any of you?
Who's the most technologically advanced member of this group? I think they might be talking about like using smartphones and stuff to track where kids are and things, maybe? I don't know. But certainly there's ways to do that, and some of our schools do that. Like when kids walk in and out of the building, they're using their phones to track where they are and if they're leaving and all of that. So my guess is there's probably ways to help, but
actually, I know
I'm not a technology
teachers
person.
that will text their students to remind them things, make sure they get their work in.
Right.
I don't know.
So people are using technology. I don't know that we're using it all that effectively. I think in the schools that are, it's certainly interesting, but I think we might be a long ways from that in Chicago.
Okay. So I guess now we can thank our speakers. Thank you. Thank you for coming.